Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Edward King, founder and president of Defense Priorities, a think tank that works to elevate and operationalize realism and restraint. Today, I'm honored to moderate a discussion today about China's nuclear buildup, its new ICBMs, submarine-launched weapons, new generation of strategic bombers, and advances in hypersonic weapons. DoD estimates indicate that China's nuclear arsenal will grow from around 350 today to approximately 1,000 by 2030. Now, the US arsenal is still 4 times as large, but it's noteworthy development nonetheless, since it's from our greatest strategic challenger. To help us understand these issues, I'm honored to introduce our distinguished speakers. Up first is Lora Saalman, a senior researcher with SIPRI's Armament and Disarmament and Conflict, Peace, and Security research areas. Her research focuses on China's cyber, nuclear, and advanced conventional weapon developments and relations to India, Russia, and the United States. David Arceneaux is assistant professor of political science at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs. He studies several topics related to international security, with a focus on nuclear weapons strategy and operations. And Lyle Goldstein, Director of Asia Engagement with us at Defense Priorities. Formerly, he served as research professor at U.S. Naval War College for 20 years. His main areas of expertise include nuclear security issues, and he has published 7 books on Chinese strategy. Lora will start with opening remarks, followed by David and then Lyle, after which we'll begin a moderated discussion where we'll try to help better understand these complex and important issues. With that, Lora, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much. And I'd like to start by thanking Defense Priorities, of course, for the invitation today. So on China's nuclear expansion, there are indications that its nuclear posture and technologies are starting to intersect with those of the United States as well as Russia, with implications for strategic stability, in particular, strategic stability talks. I will begin by briefly discussing 5 areas in which China bears increasing similarities to these 2 countries, followed by 2 key questions. So the first among these areas is China's apparent shift away from demating, under which its nuclear warheads are not mated to delivery systems during peacetime. China's sea trials of the Type 96 ballistic missile submarine, or SSBN, flight tests of the JL-3 intercontinental submarine-launched ballistic missile, and expansion of its ICBM silos all suggest that China may be moving towards pre-mating of nuclear warheads to its delivery systems. In particular, China's intended operation of SSBNs on sea patrol would likely preclude demating, as the process of loading nuclear warheads would require redocking, making the submarines vulnerable. Second, is the size of China's nuclear arsenal, as was just mentioned at the outset, which of course has historically been kept at low numbers. China's nuclear weapons arsenal is steadily growing. The U.S. Department of Defense estimate that was just mentioned is shifting from the low 300s to nearly 700 by 2027 and 1,000 by 2030. While this is still markedly smaller than the nuclear arsenals of Russia and the United States, such an increase would represent a significant increase for China. Furthermore, its construction of new missile silos, fielding of such delivery systems as the DF-41 ICBM, which is MIRVed, so it's equipped to carry multiple warheads, suggests that the operational requirements of an increased nuclear stockpile are increasingly evident. The third among these is launch on warning. China may be shifting from launching nuclear warheads after it has weathered an initial strike to retaliation upon detection of an incoming nuclear strike. Following the 2014 Chinese publication on building a strategic early warning system, China is alleged to have launched communication satellites to support launch on warning as early as 2015. China's Tongxin Jishu Shiyan 2, 5, and 6 satellites are believed to be early warning satellites, and it has deployed land-based phased array early warning radars that enhance its ability to detect incoming ballistic missiles and to conduct space surveillance and satellite tracking. All of this suggests that its infrastructure increasingly supports a higher alert status. Fourth among these are dual-capable systems, which feature delivery platforms and command and control infrastructure that support both nuclear and conventional operations. Such systems are thought to include China's DF-26 intermediate-range ballistic missile, DF-17 medium-range ballistic missile, and CJ-20 air-launched land attack cruise missile. Now, dual capable systems across the board may contribute to entanglement and escalation if conventional systems that also have nuclear applications are attacked. Fifth and final among these is machine learning and autonomy, which enable systems to learn from data and experience and to operate with limited to no human intervention. Among its activities, China has been integrating neural networks, which are a subset of machine learning, into hypersonic glide vehicles to enhance their maneuverability. And China's coupling of such hypersonic glide vehicles with fractional orbital bombardment systems, or FOBs, as well as fielding of autonomous systems that may eventually carry nuclear payloads similar to Russia's Poseidon unmanned underwater vehicle, all expand its range and its ability to evade defenses from space and from sea. Now, this nuclear expansion leads to two key questions. Does China becoming more like the United States and Russia serve as a stabilizing or destabilizing phenomenon? And why are they engaged in this expansion? Now, on the first question, while China's crossover enables more assertive behavior that could be destabilizing, particularly in terms of the US response in arms racing, and I would put the emphasis on the US response here, it diminishes China's argument that its asymmetric weakness precludes its ability to participate in high-level nuclear dialogues, and frankly, to be more transparent in a number of areas. On the second question, this expansion is rooted in part in a broader set of grievances about encirclement of China, bipartisan pressure on China in the United States, and the US pursuit of absolute security at the expense of countries like China and Russia. This being said, this expansion overall is part of Xi Jinping's long-standing quest for China to undertake its rightful position as a strong regional and global power. So with that, I'll conclude my remarks and turn it back to the moderator. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lora. David, over to you.
Great. Well, thanks. Like Lora said, thanks to everyone at Defense Priorities for bringing me in and letting me join this panel. Really excited to see how the discussion goes today. I want to build directly on everything that Lora just said and basically offer just a couple of different implications of the fine-grained details that Lora built out. And I'm going to frame my comments around two things. One is basically going to be a discussion of how does all of this stuff that China's doing fit in with its overarching nuclear strategy? And then second, what are the potential effects of arsenal expansion and modernization on crisis escalation scenarios between the United States and China moving forward? So let me start with the first point. My first question is actually going to be, is China's arsenal expansion and modernization really that surprising? The terms that people usually use in the conventional wisdom to describe China's nuclear posture is either that of assured retaliation or minimum deterrence. The phrase minimum deterrence, I think, sometimes misleads analysis when we think about this. And you can think of, if you believe that nuclear deterrence is very easy, you just need a handful of nuclear weapons. And South Africa in the 1980s with 6.5, they canceled the 7th halfway through development. You can say, okay, that's all you need to deter. But minimum deterrence does not mean that you just have a handful of nuclear weapons. It means how many do you need to guarantee that even if the adversary attacks me first, I can respond in kind with nuclear forces. And my interpretation of China's developments is that the real question is, why did they not do this decades earlier? So in 2010, there's a great piece by Evan Medeiros and Taylor Fravel. And that's effectively the motivating question is, why is a country that could develop more nuclear weapons and has had prolonged conflict with the Soviet Union and then the United States, both of which were vastly superior in terms of capabilities, why has China not already gone in this direction? And as recently as 2020, a Chinese missileer, Wu Riqiang, argued that in a scenario in which the United States attacks first, the likelihood that China could actually respond in kind with nuclear weapons is, quote, far from assured. So one way of interpreting all of these developments is really that China views this as simply necessary to maintain the same nuclear posture that has been motivating their thinking for decades already. You cannot be engaged in security competition with the United States with advanced capabilities and numerical superiority while also maintaining a small and relatively unsophisticated arsenal. So with that, I'll go to the second main point is, what does all of this mean for crisis stability? So I just framed it as, maybe don't worry too much, this is just keeping in the norm, but these are changes that do matter. Now I want to break this into some trends that are more concerning and less. And I'll start with the less concerning. First is the sheer warhead count. Going from 300 to 1,000 certainly matters. But if you look at the development of silo-based capabilities, one argument that I've seen is from folks like Jeffrey Lewis is this could be kind of the forget the name when you move the little pieces on the board around, but some of those silos might be empty. And it really is purely a quantitative effort to make sure that if the United States attacks, they have to devote more weapons, maybe to empty silos, and guarantee that China has nuclear weapons in reserve, which in some ways could actually strengthen strategic stability. Another thing that does not really concern me, and I think we might get into this more later, is this FOBS test, the Fractional Orbital Bombardment System test, that General Mark Milley called a Sputnik moment last year, said we're getting left behind and China is getting away. The quick points I'll make right now is, first, it does not make sense to test a hypersonic glide vehicle from something on a ballistic trajectory. So it's kind of a weird test anyways. And FOBs are inefficient in that weight you could otherwise devote to warhead yield are now devoted to delivery system. And given that China has this overarching strategy of assured retaliation through minimum deterrence, less is more. And my anticipation is that ballistic missiles will effectively remain their best bet for moving forward and guaranteeing deterrence. And then a third good development from this is that although it does not preclude this happening in the future, China is not pursuing tactical nuclear weapons at the moment. And that means the threshold at which you go from conventional conflict to nuclear is not as low as it might be in a US-Russia conflict. The concerns that I'll kind of go through quickly to make sure we transition over to Lyle. First, the things that Lora mentioned about pre-mating warheads to missiles and giving basically these military operators the ability, if not the authority, to use nuclear weapons. This is a change in nuclear command and control that basically reduces the amount of time for deliberation and the number of people required to make decisions. And that could be relatively concerning. And the other big one that concerns is exactly what Lora mentioned earlier with dual capable platforms. The DF-26 intermediate range ballistic missile is explicitly dual use. Those brigades trade for conventional and nuclear operations. And you can imagine a scenario in which during a conventional conflict, the United States targets those capabilities, thinking that this is necessary simply to prevail in a conventional setting. But China interprets that as an attempt to degrade their retaliatory capability. So in short, not all of these developments are equally concerning. The likelihood of nuclear use is certainly less than 1, but it is also some number greater than 0. And with that, I'll stop and turn it back over to Ed to continue the discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, David. And finally, over to you, Lyle.
Okay, sure. Thanks all for attending, and I'm really a big admirer of both my co-panelists here. So I'm so thrilled that they could join for the discussion. And I would invite you, observers of this session, to go on our website, Defense Priorities, and take a look at the explainer I wrote, which prompted this session about China's nuclear buildup. And I'll just try to summarize that quickly here, and then enjoy some discussion. As has been said, and I won't repeat the details, but we do see really what amounts to an across-the-board modernization. But part of the reason we undertook this explainer was to reinforce the idea that the U.S. still has far more warheads, and as has been said by the other panelists, that's critical to keep in mind. We also have to realize that China deliberated about this expansion for a long time, as David just said. And, what one could certainly ask, as he did, why this didn't happen earlier. And I think part of that we need to realize is part of the context. We have to think about U.S. policy as that it has partly been, a precipitating factor here. I think there's little question about that. And maybe the biggest factor there is the precipitous decline of U.S.-China relations. That is the U.S.-China relationship is in very deep trouble, I would say. And that is having an influence. There are other influences, U.S. missile defenses, changes in U.S. doctrine. So these are all part of the equation from the Chinese point of view. But I'll also make the point in the explainer that China seems to be affirming their second strike survivability. And that what they want above all is recognition that they have a credible nuclear deterrent. And they're trying to dispel all doubts about that. And that, of course, is quite relevant to a Taiwan scenario, and we can discuss that. But in general, my recommendation is that the United States not overreact. I'll get into my recommendations a little more in a second, but I do want to say one of the unique things about this explainer, and one reason I recommend you take a look at it, and indeed maybe even go through the footnotes, is because I try to bring a lot of new Chinese sources to bear, not just some leading Chinese nuclear theorists, from Fudan University and Tsinghua and so forth, but also, the usual suspect, the publications, PLA Daily and so forth. They had a statement on tactical nuclear weapons, for example, that's in there. But I try to dig a little bit deeper, as it were, go under the hood of Chinese thinking using some rather unique sources. And here I'll just suggest one example. The book by Ackerman and Stavridis being a very important U.S. strategist, former admiral, former head of NATO, had written a book called 2034, where he envisioned the war ending with a U.S.-China war ending with a nuclear exchange. This is actually discussed by Chinese sources who have turned the book around and said, look, this book shows that the U.S. is thinking hard about limited nuclear war, and we need to do so as well. So I want to share that this has become part of the dialogue in Beijing as well, and we should be conscious of that. Let me close by just making a few recommendations here. I think the U.S. should prioritize the sea leg as we go forward. We're looking at spending trillions on nuclear modernization ourselves, so we need to think through that and prioritize. We need to elevate our security dialogue with Beijing. The president is headed to Asia, I think, today, but dialogue with Beijing is not on the agenda, folks. That should cause us to scratch our heads. I think we need to put new arms control initiatives on the table. I'll love to talk more about that. Whether AI, hypersonics, tactical nuclear weapons, it should all be on the table. We can discuss these areas. And I think critically, and this is a kind of novel part of our explainer here, is we talk about spheres of influence as a way to mitigate conflict among the great powers. That was critically important in the Cold War, and it remains true today. And here we should think about how that's relevant to Taiwan. So I'll just close there. But again, thank you to the fellow panelists for a great discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Lyle, and everyone, for your opening remarks. And now I'll try to bring this conversation a little bit closer to where us laymen can understand and better understand the dynamics here. So I'd just first start by asking for one of you to explain what is no first use and why is it important to China's nuclear strategy, and has that changed based on any of these developments in modernization and expansion? And so I guess I'll start with you, Lora, if that's okay.
Certainly. I think that no first use is certainly a doctrine, a posture within China that has been existing in existence basically since its inception. The idea that China will only retaliate against nuclear weapons with nuclear weapons. And it's something that they've put a good deal of emphasis on in trying to convince the United States as well to sign on for no first use, or at least sole purpose. So that the sole purpose of nuclear weapons is to deter nuclear weapons. I think that if we look at it historically, from the inception in the 1960s until really 2013 was the point at which people started to question whether or not China might be shifting on this. China's defense white paper that came out in 2013 actually omitted reference to no first use. There's been a debate, of course, that this was not similar to the other defense white papers in the past, and that perhaps that was why they omitted it. But China, if you read through their white papers, and I recently conducted a study of the various white papers over time, what you see is, of course, similar phraseology. They don't tend to willy-nilly eliminate a reference like that without any pre-thought on it. I see that as possibly a feeler that was being sent out at the time. And also, I think the response that the United States had at the time of questioning whether no first use would last was a big offshoot of that. Now, since that time, they've been extremely adamant about no first use continuing as an unassailable aspect of their nuclear posture. And I think it is. I think that in large terms, no first use is still integral to their posture. However, it's the difficulty that I think from a Western standpoint that continues to this day is the verifiability of no first use. And also this entanglement issue that I referred to earlier between these conventional and nuclear systems and command and control, frankly. So that what is deemed to be a nuclear attack could even be carried out with a conventional system, say by a country like the United States during a conflict, and that could be escalatory because it's considered to be an attack against China's nuclear infrastructure or command and control. And I think that's the key. That's the point at which I am worried about the escalatory potential, because there is that tendency in the United States not to take no first use at face value because it's not really verifiable.
Thank you. Yeah. And anything to add on that, David or Lyle? Sure. Go ahead, Lyle.
Yeah, I do think, it's quite an important policy, although I do, myself, I always caution people, to realize that this is mainly declaratory policy and that, wartime creates all kinds of stresses, and one wonders if, I've often thought in a Taiwan scenario, if push came to shove, China might well disregard, it's been pointed out that China has changed its doctrine or reinterpreted it on the fly as suits its needs. But I think it is worth raising here that we just have gone through a nuclear posture review. I think it finished up in March here in the United States. And the rumor has it that this was very much on the table. And I think the Biden administration coming in was actively considering a no first use, but heating up of the Taiwan issue, but then coupled with the Ukraine war, which I guess we'll get to at a certain point, but that these have had an impact to just completely put that way out of bounds, partly because of the objections of allies. But my assessment is that an American no first use wouldn't play a decisive role, but I think it could help to mitigate conflict, preparation for conflict. Because at this point, I think both sides assume that the Taiwan scenario could go nuclear, and that is extremely troubling and creates all kinds of instability in the relationship, including on the nuclear level.
And David, did you have something to add there?
Sure. I mean, I'll emphasize a similar point, but from a different angle. India is the other no first use country, and that's where I've done most of my interviews overseas. And India has the stated posture of, we will, like Lora said, you only use nuclear weapons in response to a nuclear attack. And in theory, this is great because it's stabilizing. You can say, okay, conventional conflict is not great, but if we have it, it won't go nuclear so long as I don't start it. But then when I came back and interviewed a retired Pakistani general about this issue, his exact statement was that India's no first use policy is not worth the paper it's written on. So we can say and promise all we want, but at the end of the day, the trouble is when you're in a crisis over Taiwan or whatever it might be, and one side is losing, you can hope that they'll abide by their promises, but there's nothing to quite literally prevent them from crossing that nuclear threshold. And whether that means attacking US forces or halfway between a carrier strike group moving into the theater and the actual conflict, maybe we see China doing an atmospheric nuclear test. Those types of things, maybe that's within the realm of no first use. So they can change, they're open to interpretation, and adversaries just simply struggle to believe them.
And I keep hearing people talk about using nuclear weapons and people imagine detonating them. But nuclear weapons are being used right now, we're seeing in the Ukraine war. And so Russia's invasion and their use of nuclear weapons. And Lyle, if you could sort of expound a little bit, and then I'd like to hear what David and Lora think of your arguments from your paper about how China wants to make sure and hopefully I'm categorizing this correctly, that the United States is aware of and respects China's nuclear arsenal, such that in the event of an invasion of Taiwan, that the United States hesitates or decides not to get involved. Can you explain that a little bit and the thinking behind that?
Yeah, sure. Now, I mean, my paper was mostly drafted before the Ukraine war began, but I did have, I did reflect on it a bit, and I think that it is quite a relevant situation, and notably, China has watched Russia's, and I will say, frankly, admired China has watched Russia's nuclear modernization for a very long period and admired it. As I said, they certainly took on board that Putin, one of his first measures after the war started and right before was to put his forces on special alert. So I do think, there are some shadows of this. And by the way, I know David spoke about that China has not made a move to develop tactical nuclear weapons, but I will say I have reams of Chinese articles saying why these would be useful. So it is a very serious concern that the relationship may go that way, and that one of China's lessons coming out of the Ukraine war is that, boy, it's nice to have these things. Just last thing I'll say is that I think everybody can realize that the U.S. from the beginning has taken Russia's nuclear arsenal and nuclear threats here very seriously. And even in the initial days, I think the Biden administration said it would not take certain moves to make sure to avoid war with Russia. And most people agree with those steps. So China's watching all this and wants to make sure that in a Taiwan scenario that the U.S. would only move with serious reluctance, and the flip side of that they would not try to use their nuclear superiority against China to threaten China or China's actions in a Taiwan scenario.
David, do you have some remarks on that?
Sure, not too much to add. And just to emphasize Lyle's point, the fear that they could go tactical is very real. And we're lucky that we have not seen that trend yet. Fiona Cunningham at Penn is working on trying to explain. It's another one of those, why would they not have already done this? But the potential for them, in the same way that the question went from why have they not expanded and now they're expanding, the question of why have they not gone tactical almost invites a thought of maybe we should go tactical. So that is a very real possibility. And to your original point, Ed, about just kind of when we say nuclear use, what does that entail? You're right that it entails everything from a massive launch all the way down to kind of signaling. And the different angle I'll try to put on this is that in these crisis scenarios, the hard part is trying to maintain deterrence below the nuclear threshold. And this is what Thomas Schelling, for all of my nerd friends in academia and international relations, will be familiar with brinkmanship. But what that effectively means is you need to be able to operate in a scary world, and you continue passing the buck back to your adversary. And you put the onus on them to escalate the conflict. So what we've been watching in the war in Ukraine is Russia kind of makes these very vague, like, just so you know, we've got these things. And the West kind of goes, yeah, we know, we've got it. And then you keep seeing these tailored responses of, well, technically we're not pulling the trigger, but we are in Eastern Poland training and equipping and providing everything that they need. We're doing everything but pulling the trigger. And this is getting really close to directly killing Russians, but it's one step removed. And what that looks like with Russia, which has a potential first use nuclear doctrine, a lot of room for interpretation and a big debate over, do they have this escalate to de-escalate strategy? It looks different from what we see in China right now. And I guess this is why the two things that could happen. One, what Laura's mentioned about basically increasing arsenal readiness through higher levels of preparedness in command and control procedures. And then Lyle's point about if tactical nuclear weapons come into play, the number of options for nuclear use expand in a way that somebody might think, this actually helps me achieve my political objectives, and I think it will stop short of total nuclear war.
And go ahead, Lyle.
Yeah, I just want to say, I mean, we're, I think, coming up on a big anniversary, the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. But it's important to keep in mind, this is most people agree this was the world's most dangerous moment, and one of the big reasons was tactical nuclear weapons. And I actually interviewed one of those Russian submarine captains who had literally his trigger finger on a tactical nuclear weapon that would have hit the U.S. fleet, that was pursuing him. But I mean, that's just one of several instances where tactical nuclear weapons seem to have been quite possibly the major trigger for an all-out nuclear war. So I just, underline 3 times that danger. And I must also say, and I'll maybe ask this to my other panelists, but like, I don't know that we will know when China crosses that threshold. I was just reading David Logan's good piece in International Security, where he talks about, nuclear superiority, and how different people have different interpretations. And I think clearly, we don't want to assume that we fully understand China's arsenal. I don't think we do. And by the way, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, we did not know that Russian submarines had tactical nuclear weapons on board. That was a new capability. We were unaware of it.
Yeah, go ahead, Laura. Love to hear from you on this too.
Yeah, I'd like to chime in as well. I think that, and I think it's important that we reemphasize, obviously, that what Russia has been doing so far, at the very least, has been raising the nuclear alert status, has not used nuclear weapons, but has certainly used them as a tool of coercion or deterrence. Escalate to de-escalate is, of course, the term that David referred to, has been used a good deal. Now, I just finished conducting a systematic study of their white papers, their defense strategy, alongside that of China. And what I thought was reassuring, of course, is the fact that China has been, quote unquote, exercising restraint, particularly on tactical nuclear weapons and its posture. And of course, this is all declaratory in many respects. But if we talk about exercising restraint, I think we also have to keep in mind whose vantage point are they exercising restraint from. If you ask anyone in Taiwan, has China been exercising restraint in terms of its activities in their perimeter? They will say no. And also these intermediate range and medium range systems that David and I referred to, of course, that are dual capable, suggests that in the future, we may be looking at something more tactical that's being used in various theaters. I also wanted to emphasize on this point with China and its, I don't want to say alignment with Russia on Ukraine, but certainly I think China has for a long time, it's been underappreciated, the fact that it appreciates the pressure that Russia is under from NATO. It's in their white papers. It's not just delineated in this recent joint statement between the two countries earlier this year. China cites concerns over NATO and understanding of Russia's dilemma in its 2015, 2019 white papers. China also has a longstanding view, as I mentioned at the outset, of U.S. encirclement. They see this as hindering their rise, similar to Russia. Formation of an Asian version of NATO through U.S. alliance networks. This was heightened most recently with the AUKUS unification through Australia, UK, and the United States. They see U.S. mixed signaling and high-level visits to Taiwan. Pressure on China, in other words, from all sides. I just spoke recently with a PLA officer about these various issues, and he was very adamant that look, from China's standpoint, this is some form of, even if it's a smaller version of NATO forming in the Asia-Pacific region. So I think it's important to keep those ideas in mind when we talk about China's response to all this. That being said, one last point I would make quickly is that China does have things in place, once again, declaratory, but they do have negative security assurances towards non-nuclear weapon states. These have been in place since the 1990s, 1994. 1995, they extended these to all non-nuclear weapon states, that it would provide assistance to non-nuclear weapon states if attacked by a state using a nuclear weapon. So that would apply directly to Russia. And it really complicates China's response to what we see happening in Ukraine. And not only that, in 2013, they repeated this positive security assurance in their bilateral agreement with Ukraine, whereby, and I'm quoting here, China would provide corresponding security assurances to Ukraine in the event of aggression or threat of aggression using nuclear weapons. So the language is similar to that of the P5s. It's really about how much we invest in these declaratory statements, these treaties and so on, to think that a country like China or others will actually respond in the way that they have said they will respond. Thanks.
Yeah, there's a lot there. And Lyle mentioned previously a no first use option, under consideration for the United States. But there's some tension because of the United States alliance commitments that are undergirded by our nuclear weapons. Can you talk a little bit, and Lora, we'll go to you and then back to David and then Lyle. Can you talk a little bit about how nuclear weapons play into our alliance commitments and dictates our nuclear posture? Obviously understanding that there's another nuclear posture review underway that we're expecting at some point from the Biden administration. So please.
Yeah, so I think that when we look at the U.S. nuclear posture, and particularly I'm preceding a review, which has not been made fully public yet. But I think that historically, the United States and its practice of extended deterrence, so vis-a-vis its allies, has been integral to the U.S. nuclear posture. Now, those alliance networks, actually, this is not new to the Biden administration. The Obama administration considered no first use or actually sole purpose back when they were looking at their nuclear posture review. At least that's the word on the street. That's the discussion that's out there. And they received a good deal of pushback, apparently, from U.S. allies, Japan, South Korea, among others. Of course, because they see this nuclear umbrella as serving a role for them in the region in particular. And I think that the Ukraine crisis currently has actually made a number of NATO countries and non-NATO countries, we've seen this with Finland and Sweden, two staunch opponents towards nuclear weapons, completely entrenched in this idea of disarmament, even considered joining NATO and applying for NATO membership simply because they see this pressure coming in from Russia. So I see this as being further entrenched, actually, by what is occurring in Ukraine currently in the U.S. posture. This being said, I wanted to emphasize this. I thought it was interesting. David mentioned interviews he'd conducted in South Asia. We just finished a project on South Asia, actually at SIPRI. We also conducted interviews of U.S. Former officials and researchers. And one of the things that really stood out to me is one of them said, look, the U.S. practices extended deterrence, right? This idea of a nuclear umbrella for its allies. This could be considered to be escalate to de-escalate, right? We keep talking about how Russia is maybe practicing that. This idea that you are going to escalate to de-escalate a crisis scenario is integral in their view, also in the United States nuclear posture. And I think that's something that could be debated, but I think it's an important thing to keep in mind. And that this raising of alert statuses that is now going on with Russia, the U.S. has raised its alert status in the past, its nuclear alert status. So it's not unique to Russia. It's something that has occurred historically. Thanks.
David, do you have something to add here?
Sure. So first and foremost, allow me to be shameless and plug that I've recruited a group of folks. Whenever the nuclear posture review actually comes out, we have Daryl Press, Nick Miller, Heather Williams, and maybe Rupal Mehta will be doing a discussion on it. I think that Congress is focused on other security issues right now, but I'll be trying to put together something that addresses a lot of these issues, both with regional focuses and broader. But more specifically and less shamelessly, I will talk about the extended deterrence point here and kind of say that 2 points. One is extended deterrence serves at least two main purposes. One is a genuine effort to protect what the United States has identified as core interest, and that could be the promotion and, I guess, support of democratic regimes, the security of friendly countries, and we'll focus on East Asia for right now. But it also serves another mission as a tool of non-proliferation. Part of the reason why the United States is so willing to throw out the nuclear umbrella so easily is the belief amongst many policymakers is that it is better that we take this risk than create the conditions for a world in which multiple other states get nuclear weapons. So those are two different challenges that the United States has to kind of juggle at the same time. And the thing that underpins all of this, and this is not a new problem, and for anyone who reads anything about extended deterrence in the Cold War, Charles de Gaulle has basically, I always mix up the cities, but the great quotation of, is the United States really willing to trade New York City for Brussels or Paris or whatever cities he has in his statement. And this is fundamentally a credibility problem. So the United States is in a position now in East Asia where it is promising, sometimes more explicitly than others too. The clarity of this promise also varies across locations. That if things get out of hand, don't worry, we've got your back with nuclear weapons. But imagine a world in which one of the scenarios we talked about earlier plays out and a Taiwan event occurs. There's an atmospheric nuclear test halfway between U.S. military forces and Taiwan. It is now incumbent upon the U.S. policymaker to decide, am I about to sail right through that detonation zone? I mean, not right through, but am I going to really continue playing this game? And extended deterrence is hard to convince your allies that you really mean it. So we're starting to bucket now into forward deployed forces, certain types of military capabilities, hence the big disagreement over whether the United States should have submarine-launched cruise missiles, et cetera. And that is kind of a launching point from which a lot of these discussions and debates that we're about to see for the nuclear posture review, that's from where they will emerge.
Well, something you just said, and Lyle, we'll give you a chance to respond here as well, but there seems to be, again, another tension here in the goal of aiding non-proliferation. You know, the U.S. nuclear arsenal aims to curb that, but at the same time, it seems to be thinking or influencing China's thinking about the need to expand its nuclear arsenal. And so how effective is that? Is that a good way to achieve that goal, or what else, can and should be done about it? And at least should there be more awareness of these dynamics in the conversation?
Yeah, if I can just quickly respond to that, the way I would jump in here is to say that the type of proliferation, we can think of two types. One is horizontal, which means new countries getting nuclear weapons. And the other is vertical, which is really what's motivating our discussion today, China expanding its arsenal. And I think a good US policymaker would say, well, we're really doing this to prevent horizontal proliferation. So therefore, we've been successful, no worries, all is well. But I think you're right that to the extent that the United States promise to use nuclear weapons in these events becomes more credible, the pressures on vertical proliferation specifically also do increase.
Go ahead, Lora, and then to Lyle. I know Lyle's ready to get in here too.
Sorry to interrupt, Lyle.
No, good,
I just had a really quick point on this, because I think this horizontal versus vertical proliferation is an important distinction to make. That being said, if you look at the Chinese response, for example, I mentioned this idea that is current within China, that there is a formation of some version of NATO, right, within the region. They are looking, of course, at the United States providing not just security guarantees towards these countries, but weaponry as well. And from a nuclear standpoint, the most recent talking point within China, of course, has been this AUKUS that I mentioned before, Australia, UK, and the United States, that the United States, of course, supplying things like nuclear submarines or otherwise would be constituting some form of horizontal proliferation to a non-nuclear weapon state like Australia. So I just wanted to throw that in there, because I think that is part of their logic for why we are potentially veering into dangerous territory, both vertical and horizontal proliferation. Thanks.
Yeah, just a quick comment on extended deterrence. I mean, I really do see a lot of problematic aspects of this kind of the U.S. leading forward. And while I do admit, this tends to dampen forces in Tokyo or Berlin or places like that to, where that could conceivably desire nuclear weapons. But I still think that to me, we're dealing with a lot of kind of exaggerated threat perceptions that are creating, really fueling this very dangerous set of dynamics. For example, I find it, totally far-fetched. I mean, well, let's step back for a second. I mean, one of the lessons of the Ukraine war so far is Russia's immense weakness here. So, I mean, the idea that Berlin and Paris or something are under grave threat and that they need this grand nuclear umbrella. I mean, it's good that they're building up in a reasonable way. But to me, the idea that they're going to be a victim of Russian nuclear coercion, I think it remains far-fetched. The same with Tokyo. I find the same. And This, by interceding the United States directly into the China-Japan security relationship, you get in this very bizarre set of circumstances where the U.S. maybe is contemplating nuclear war over some rocks in the East China Sea that could have goats on it. To me, we need to clarify our commitments and try to kind of reduce them. And if that means, ultimately that Japan feels it's absolutely necessary to protect those goats to create their own nuclear arsenal, which again, I find quite unlikely, but they, so be it. We might have to live in such a world, but I have trouble as an American, accepting that we need to have this forward presence that, includes missile defenses, nuclear alerts, and the rest of it, that continues to fuel a intense U.S.-China nuclear rivalry that really should not exist. So just coming back to where we started, I mean, part of the reason we have not done a no first use is because Tokyo and Berlin vociferously said we cannot live in that world. I think that's frankly ludicrous.
Certainly, you've opened a can of worms there that we might have to have a follow-on discussion just on that issue. Yeah, I'm also curious to think, I guess, to talk a little bit about missile defense. So we've talked about that a little bit. And David, I'd like to hear your thoughts, at least to explain, is that something U.S. policy should consider? Certainly, it's something I hear about a lot in my conversations. What are the dynamics and what are the sort of the pros and cons and limitations to that?
Sure. So U.S. ballistic missile defense is an area where I get myself in trouble quite often because I'm fairly skeptical from a purely technological perspective that this can work. And I think that examples like the Iron Dome system operating so well in the May conflict last year, and these fantastical videos that make it look like, oh, look at how wonderful this is. Why isn't the United States doing more? Qualitatively, these are very different systems. And in reality, if you think about what it takes to intercept a ballistic missile, these things are coming from maybe over 10,000 kilometers away. They're traveling at something upwards of like Mach 20. And the way it was described to me by a physicist one time is it's like looking into the sky for a fly that's buzzing around through a straw. So it's not a surprise that the United States' ballistic missile defense, ground-based mid-course defense, this kind of GMD is the big one right now. And it has about a 55% success rate. And that is in ideal circumstances where you know what time the missile is launching, from where to where. If it's bad weather, they cancel the test and they postpone it. So if it's already 55%, now put it in a real crisis scenario where those conditions are not met and it will be worse. The response to this is, oh, well, ballistic missile defense is actually not for China. It is for North Korea and maybe Iran sometime in the future. And even then, the American Physics Society came out recently with a report that was really fascinating and basically said, okay, let's take it on its most favorable terms. If the United States attacks North Korea first and gets all but a handful of missiles, and North Korea shoots back one or two, would the United States be able to intercept that return salvo? And the short answer was almost certainly no. Probably not anyways. Maybe they could, but it would be very unlikely. And then it becomes, for your game theorist out there, like probability might be low, but the cost is really high. Are you willing to incur that? But even with these systems that appear not to work, think back to the FOBS test and the hypersonic glide vehicle discussion we've had. If there's any clear explanation for why China is pursuing those capabilities, it is almost certainly because China cannot trust that U.S. ballistic missile defense is not also for China. And there are a lot of technical things that concern China. So the United States has reliable acoustic passive sensors that basically outside the first island chain, it makes it hard for China to leave the first island chain without being noticed. The passive ground-based sensors are getting better. U.S. precision with super fuses, compensating fuses is getting better. China has to be worried about this. And it's moved to expand its arsenal to make sure if the United States attacks first, it has something to beat BMD. And its changes in how it's the types of delivery systems, FOBs and hypersonic glide vehicles, and its pre-mating and higher readiness, these are all somehow related to ballistic missile defense. And in my mind, the concern is we're in the worst of both worlds. Ballistic missile defense probably doesn't work, but the adversary, in this case China, thinks it works and does the stuff that makes it harder to defend and defeat anyways.
Certainly not a simple issue. Lora, did you have something to add on that? Yes, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in. Having discussed this with a Chinese missileer, actually, you made this argument very early on, because I, similar to David, I am skeptical of the technological advances of missile defense and ability to intercept everything that is coming in. And of course, the United States has invested in this in such a large way, bipartisan support, and so on and so forth. His response when I discussed this with this missileer was that China must prepare for when missile defense achieves its aims, right? When it is built out to the extent that the United States, of course, hopes it would be in the future. And really, when we think about China, even more so than Russia vis-a-vis missile defense, the proximity issue for a lot of these systems that were just mentioned, not only those that are on the U.S. mainland, but also those that are being forward deployed in the region, are of massive concern within China. It's why there was such a strong pushback against THAAD deployment in South Korea, right? And the radars that would be able to see into China's territory. This being said, China has long, at least among the technical community that I know, and within the PLA, relied on this idea that decoys would save the day, right? You know, they can trick the systems, the missile defense systems of the United States, and in a lot of cases they probably can with the decoys, right? You have multiple pseudo warheads on a system, or put into space these balloons, right? That necessarily look like missiles coming in and cause the United States to waste its time and effort and resources. But what has recently come in, and I want to put an emphasis on this, of course, that David just mentioned, are these hypersonic glide vehicles. In another event, actually, that I participated in recently, they said, one of the Chinese participants emphasized, they said, part of the reason people are wondering why are China and Russia ahead of the United States in terms of developing their hypersonic glide and other technologies is because they have to. They have to be ahead of the United States. It's not as much of a priority for the United States to have hypersonic glide as it is for China and Russia, of course, to be able to defeat these missile defenses. So there is an escalatory variable there in terms of arms racing, in terms of building up these capabilities. But missile defense certainly is in the background in many of these considerations.
Yeah, go ahead, Lyle.
Yeah, just a couple of comments. I mean, all good points by my colleagues that I agree with. But, you know, one of the troubling things about the missile defense calculation is here that I mean, potentially you have the whole U.S.-China relationship is sort of hostage to the U.S.-North Korea relationship, which is really, you know, very troubling. And so, you know, I guess we can blame everything on Mr. Kim, but I mean, that's not very satisfying. And unfortunately, it has become a huge driver. And, you know, I do think Chinese concerns, you know, are very sincere. I would just remind people that, you know, we're looking at the Ukraine war and looking at its shadows here. You got Aegis ashore facilities in both Romania and Poland, you know, that the Russians complained about going back a decade. When Putin says, you know, NATO infrastructure in Eastern Europe is a problem, this is what he's talking about. And, you know, I saw people argue till they're blue in the face on these issues that they don't threaten Russia, but, you know, not very convincing to them. And I worry about the same kind of process rolling forward in East Asia. On the hypersonic stuff, I think Laura's point just at the end there is really important. And yeah, I think we just tested our first successful hypersonic test, I think, by the Air Force. China's deployed this, I think, since 2019, the DF-17. So, I mean, it's deployed operational, folks. One last comment I'll make. This is just to show you how ironic coming back to North Korea, but I was on a session recently where a very wise nuclear strategist commented that our best hope in a North Korea scenario isn't relying on our own missile defenses, actually asking China to use its missile defenses, or like an S-400 or something, to shoot down the North Korean missile in boost phase, because it probably has to fly right over northern China. So they have the Chinese actually have their best shot. So think about that, the irony of that, folks. In a North Korea scenario, our best hope may be a phone call to Beijing saying, can you take care of this?
Well, I've got a bunch of more. I have a lot more questions to ask, but we're running up against time here, and I want to leave a little bit of room for closing remarks. And so, before I turn it over, maybe you guys can incorporate this into your answers and final remarks. Is what are U.S. goals vis-a-vis U.S. China and its nuclear weapons? And so, I know that's a broad question. But are we looking for more stability in the relationship? Is it to limit the number of weapons they have? What is the goal, and how do you see this playing out in terms of stabilizing versus destabilizing, a theme that each of you have talked about? Maybe we'll go to you first, Lyle, since you were last.
All right. I mean, the goals for U.S. nuclear weapons, you said.
Or U.S. policy in general, should we be more concerned with China's overall number of warheads and the posture that they have, stability between the two powers? What is it that's most important, and how can U.S. policy, be designed to achieve those outcomes?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I want to say that in our explainer, I definitely emphasize that we do have to modernize our force. I mean, I think many have pointed out that it just in some aspects it's sort of creaking to the point of being dangerous, and there's just certain safety issues. But our force, I think, can be very strong, but also rather limited. And there, I do think we should focus on that sea leg, which I think, because of our geography, very different than China's, but our sea leg is extremely survivable and effective for the vast foreseeable future. So I think that should be our focus. But I do advocate, as the best way forward with Beijing, not only putting some chips on the deterrent side, but also definitely on the reassurance side. That involves a robust arms control track. And I think Lora really set up that discussion really well by saying, hey, to China, you can't have it both ways. If you're going to modernize, then you have no excuse not to play in the arms control realm. By the way, a lot of people are dismissive of China on arms control. I'm not. I think, whether it's the test ban treaty, or I think they had that very helpful double freeze proposal that was helpful on Korea. So I think there's reasons to think they've floated some proposals on AI. I think there are reasons to go there. We have to change the tone in U.S.-China relations generally, but also on the nuclear side, and develop this much more cooperative tone. If I get another chance, though, I'll also talk about Taiwan. We have to lower the temperature on Taiwan, because if everybody thinks that a war might happen tomorrow or next month, then these nuclear questions will continue to percolate in dangerous ways. So we need to work on that side too, crisis management.
Great. So real quickly, if you guys have any response to that, otherwise we'll jump into closing remarks. Okay, so we'll go in the exact same order then. Lora, please, if you could close out your thoughts here.
Sure. Actually, and this builds off of what Lyle was just saying. I think that in terms of discussing U.S. goals and where it needs to be, the U.S. did have a process in place. In fact, it had conducted 3 meetings with Russia prior to the Ukraine crisis, which are these strategic stability dialogues. Now, of course, that entire process has broken down in the wake of Ukraine, but it's an important one that I hope will resume once, hopefully, the conflict subsides. I think on the Chinese side, certainly the United States has floated the idea of having strategic stability dialogues with China. The Biden-Xi discussion then from November, you have Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, coming out and saying that there is some momentum to have these dialogues with China. And even from the Chinese side, while they're more muted in their response, they're interested. So I think those types of dialogues, I would even not call them arms control talks, because arms control talks necessarily means you're going to be constraining your capabilities, your second strike capability, and so on. I think strategic stability dialogues do offer more latitude that will encourage China to hopefully come to the table with this transparency that I mentioned earlier, this de facto transparency from these tests, from the ICBM silos, all the things that we see that are already out there. One point I'd make as I conclude is that for U.S. goals, it's important to talk about the goals for Russia and China as well. They can't just be about U.S. goals without thinking about what their concerned about. We talked about this today already on missile defense. You have also in the joint statement between the two countries that came out earlier this year, high precision guidance non-nuclear weapons, medium and intermediate range systems, missile defense, outer space, artificial intelligence. They have already sent out a signal that these are the topics that concern China and Russia and that they want to engage more upon. So I think that actually in terms of the US approach as it moves into the future, they already have an open invitation. They just have to open that door.
Great. Wonderful. Thank you, Lora. David, 60 seconds or so.
Sure. Really fast. The very short version is what scares me is the potential for crisis escalation. And this is rooted largely in the United States. I usually think of US foreign policy as being centered around security, economic, and values-based interests. Non-proliferation, defending allies for security, free trade, open markets for economic, democracy, human rights for values. Almost all of those points, almost all, are in opposition to what China wants in some instances. And as China becomes more capable of advancing and defending its interests in its own backyard, and the United States, if it's unwilling to give on any of those fronts, the pathways to escalation that we've talked about earlier with conventional nuclear integration, higher readiness, et cetera, those are the places where I would be wanting US policymakers to be really devoting attention to say, if we start to lose control, how do we get it back under control quickly?
Wow. Great. Thank you so much, David. And Lyle, finally over to you for quick closing remarks.
Okay. Yeah. Well, just want to, again, really emphatically thank my colleagues here for participating in this session and dialoguing with us at Defense Priorities on these critical issues. As I said, I think we need to change the tone in U.S.-China relations. You're going to see a lot of photos of Biden hobnobbing around East Asia in the next few days, but ask yourself, when is the next Xi-Biden summit? Hopefully it won't be a stilted kind of online affair of an hour or two. No, we need something much more intensive engagement than that. We need a multi-day summit in person that carves out maybe a whole day just to talk about nuclear weapons and crisis stability. There's so many things that we could work on with China, from artificial intelligence to like a mutual vulnerability statement. We have done successful conflict mitigation with China, like in the Navy side, we did the code for unplanned encounters, which is having real impact on operations in a positive way. So there is, but we also need to talk candidly about spheres of influence, and that means having a very candid discussion, including among Americans ourselves, about Taiwan. And here, I think we have to take it off the table, the possibility that the U.S. and China would fight a war or a nuclear war over Taiwan. We have to be clear in our own minds that we're not going to go there. I think President Biden was clear about Ukraine from the beginning. He said, we're not going to go there, and we will not go there. We really need to have a similar candid discussion among ourselves on this critical issue too. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. An important issue, and certainly an important relationship to get right between the United States and China. I just want to thank again our distinguished panelists for offering their insight and analysis and joining us. Thank you, Lora and David and Lyle. I encourage everyone to please sign up at defp.org to get alerts about future events like this and other analysis. Subscribe to our YouTube page, and really thanks again for joining us. I appreciate it.